Hello, it's Fran. Sarah Hoyt, the fantasy and science fiction writer, has an excellent piece up at her website today, according to Hoyt, titled Beware Moving Cheese. It concerns how the loss of the future that people expect can cause them to go into paralysis or despair at their inability to adjust to the changes around them. And she provides several examples of how this has happened and how it is happening now. And it put me in mind of a story, a very relevant story, even though the fundamental motif of the story is diametrically the opposite of the one that Sarah talks about. And I thought I would read it to you. The author is long dead. He was known principally for writing very funny fiction, but there were times when he wasn't being funny at all. And the story I'm about to read you is one of that kind. I'll tell you the author's name and the title of the story after I've read it. Lanigan dreamed the dream again and managed to wake himself with a hoarse cry. He sat upright in bed and glared around him into the violet darkness. His teeth clenched and his lips were pulled back into a spastic grin. Beside him he felt his wife, Estelle, stir and sit up. Lanigan didn't look at her. Still caught in his dream, he waited for tangible proofs of the world. A chair slowly drifted across his field of vision and fetched up against the wall with a quiet thump. Lanigan's face relaxed slightly. Then Estelle's hand was on his arm. The touch was meant to be soothing, but it burned like lye. "Here," she said, "drink this." "No," he said, "I'm all right now." "Drink it anyhow." "No, really, I really am all right." For now he was completely out of the grip of the nightmare. He was himself again, and the world was its habitual self. That was very precious to Lanigan. He didn't want to let go of it just now, not even for the soothing release of a sedative. "Was it the same dream?" Estelle asked him. "Yes, just the same. I don't want to talk about it." "All right," Estelle said. She's humoring me, Lanigan thought. I frighten her. I frighten myself. She asked, "Hon, what time is it?" Lanigan looked at his watch. 6:15. But as he said it, the hour hand jumped convulsively forward. "No, it's 5 to 7. "Can you get back to sleep?" "I don't think so," he said. "I think I'll stay up." "That's fine, dear," Estelle said. She yawned, closed her eyes, opened them again, and asked, "Hon, don't you think it might be a good idea if you called—" "I have an appointment with him for 12:10, Lanigan said. "That's fine," Estelle said. She closed her eyes again. Sleep came over her while Lanigan watched. Her auburn hair turned a faint blue, and she sighed once, heavily. He got out of bed and dressed. He was, for the most part, a large man, unusually easy to recognize. His features were curiously distinct. He had a rash on his neck. He was in no other way outstanding except that he had a recurring dream which was driving him insane. He spent the next few hours on his front porch, watching stars go nova in the dawn sky. Later he went out for a stroll. As luck would have it, he ran into George Torstein just 2 blocks from his house. Several months earlier, in an incautious moment, he had told Torstein about his dream. Torstein was a bluff, hearty fellow, a great believer in self-help, discipline, practicality, common sense, and other dull virtues. His hard-headed, no-nonsense attitude had come as a momentary relief to Lanigan, but now it acted as an abrasive. Men like Torstein were undoubtedly the salt of the earth and the backbone of the country, but for Lanigan, wrestling with the impalpable and losing, Torstein had grown from a nuisance into a horror. "Well, Tom," Torstein said, "how's the boy?" "Fine," Lanigan said, "just fine." He nodded pleasantly and began to walk away under a melting green sky, but one did not escape from Torstein so easily. "Tom, boy, I've been thinking about your problem," Torstein said. "I've been quite disturbed about you." Well, that's very nice of you, Lanigan said, but really you shouldn't concern yourself. I do it because I want to, Torstein said, speaking the simple, deplorable truth. I take an interest in people, Tom, always have, ever since I was a boy. And you and I have been friends and neighbors for a long time. That's true enough, Lanigan said numbly. The worst thing about needing help, he thought, was having to accept it. Well, Tom, I think what would really help you would be a little vacation. Torstein had a simple prescription for everything. Since he practiced soul doctoring without a license, he was always careful to prescribe a remedy you could get over the counter. I really can't afford a vacation this month, Lanigan said. The sky was ochre and pink now. 3 pines had withered. An aged oak had turned into a youthful cactus. Torstein laughed heartily. Boy, you can't afford not to take a vacation just now. Have you considered that? No, Lanigan said. I haven't. Well, consider it. You're tired, tense, all keyed up. You've been working too hard. I've been on leave of absence all this week, Lanigan said. He glanced at his watch. The gold case had turned to lead, but the time seemed accurate enough. Nearly 2 hours had passed since the beginning of the conversation. It isn't good enough, Torstein was saying. You've stayed right here in town, close to your work. You need to get in touch with nature, Tom. When was the last time you went camping? Camping? I don't think I've ever gone camping. There, you see, boy, you've got to put yourself back in touch with real things. Not streets and buildings, but mountains and rivers. Lanigan looked at his watch again and was relieved to see that it had turned back to gold. He was glad. He'd paid $60 for that case. Trees and lakes, Torstein was rhapsodizing. The feel of grass growing under your feet. The sight of tall black mountains marching across a golden sky. Lanigan shook his head. I've been in the country, George. It doesn't do anything for me. But Torstein was obstinate. You must get away from artificialities. It all seems equally artificial, Lanigan said. Trees or buildings, what's the difference? Men make buildings, Torstein intoned rather piously, but God makes trees. Lanigan had his doubts about both propositions, but he wasn't going to tell them to Torstein. You might have something there, he said. I'll think about it. You do that, Torstein said. Happens I know the perfect place. It's in Maine, Tom, and it's right near this little lake. Torstein was a master of the interminable description. Luckily for Lanigan, there was a diversion. Across the street, a house burst into flames. Hey, whose house is that? Lanigan asked. Makelby's, Torstein said. That's his 3rd fire this month. Maybe we ought to give the alarm, Lanigan said. You're right. I'll do it myself, Torstein said. Remember what I told you about that place in Maine, Tom. Torstein turned to go, and something rather humorous happened. As he stepped over the pavement, the concrete liquefied under his left foot. Caught unawares, he went in ankle deep. His forward motion pitched him headfirst into the street. Tom hurried to help him out before the concrete hardened again. Are you all right? Twisted my damned ankle, Torstein muttered. It's okay, I can walk. He limped off to report the fire. Lanigan stayed and watched. He judged that the fire had been caused by spontaneous combustion. In a few minutes, as he had expected, it put itself out by spontaneous decombustion. One shouldn't be pleased by another man's misfortunes, but Lanigan couldn't help chuckling about Torstein's twisted ankle. Not even the sudden appearance of floodwaters on Main Street could mar his good spirits. He beamed at something like a steamboat with yellow stacks as it went by in the sky. Then he remembered his dream, and the panic began again. He walked quickly to the doctor's office. Dr. Sampson's office was small and dark that week. The old gray sofa was gone. In its place were 2 Louis XV chairs and a hammock. The worn carpet had finally rewoven itself, and there was a cigarette burn on the puce ceiling. But the portrait of Mario Andretti was in its usual place on the wall, and the big free-form ashtray was scrupulously clean. The inner door opened, and Dr. Sampson's head popped out. "Hi," he said. "Won't be a minute." His head popped back in again. Samson was as good as his word. It took him exactly 3 seconds by Lanigan's watch to do whatever he had to do. 1 second later, Lanigan was stretched out on the leather couch with a fresh paper doily under his head, and Samson was saying, "Well, Tom, how have things been going?" "The same," Lanigan said. "Worse." "The dream?" Lanigan nodded. "Let's just run through it again," Samson said. "I'd rather not," Lanigan said. "Are you afraid?" "More afraid than ever, Doc." "Even now?" "Yes, especially now." There was a moment of therapeutic silence. Then Dr. Samson said, "You've spoken before of your fear of this dream, but you've never told me why you fear it so." "Well, it sounds so silly." Samson's face was serious, quiet, composed, the face of a man who found nothing silly, who was constitutionally incapable of finding anything silly. It was a pose, perhaps, but one which Lanigan found reassuring. "All right, I'll tell you," Lanigan said abruptly. Then he stopped. "Go on," Dr. Samson said. "Well, it's because I believe that somehow, in some way I don't understand." "Yes, do go on." "Well, that somehow the world of my dream is becoming the real world." He stopped again, and then went on with a rush. "And that someday I am going to wake up and find myself in that world. And then that world will have become the real one, and this one will have been just a dream." He turned to see how this mad revelation had affected Samson. But if the doctor was disturbed, he didn't show it. He was quietly lighting his pipe with the smoldering tip of his left forefinger. He blew out his forefinger and said, "Yes, please go on." "Go on? But that's it. That's the whole thing," Lanigan said. A spot the size of a quarter appeared on Samson's mauve carpet. It darkened, thickened, grew into a small fruit tree. Samson picked one of the purple pods, sniffed at it, then set it down on his desk. He looked at Lanigan sternly and rather sadly. "You've told me about your dream world before, Tom." Lanigan nodded. "We have discussed it, traced its origins, analyzed its meaning for you. In past months we have learned, I believe, why you need to cripple yourself with this nightmare fear." Lanigan nodded unhappily. "Yet," Samson said, "you refuse the insights. You forget each time that your dream world is a dream, nothing but a dream, operated by arbitrary dream laws which you have invented to satisfy a psychic need." "I wish I could believe that," Lanigan said. "The trouble is that my dream world is so damnably reasonable." "Not at all," Samson said. "It's that your delusion is hermetic, self-enclosed, and self-sustaining. A man's actions are based upon certain assumptions about the nature of the world. Grant his assumptions, and his behavior is entirely reasonable. But to change those assumptions, those fundamental axioms, is nearly impossible. For example, how do you prove to a man that he is not being controlled by a secret radio that only he can hear?" "I see the problem," Lanigan muttered. "Is that me?" "Yes, Tom, in effect, that is you. You want me to prove to you that this world is real and that the world of your dream is false. You propose to give up your fantasy if I supply you with the required proof." "Yes, exactly," Lanigan cried. "But you see, I can't supply it," Samson said. "The nature of the world is apparent, but it is also unprovable." Lanigan thought for a while. "Look, Doc, I'm not as sick as the guy with the secret radio, am I?" "No, you're not. You're more reasonable, more rational. You have doubts about the reality of the world, but luckily you also have doubts about the validity of your delusion." "Then give it a try," Lanigan said. "I understand the problem, but I swear to you, I'll accept anything I can possibly bring myself to accept." It's not my field, really, Samson said. This sort of thing calls for a metaphysician. I don't think I'd be very skilled at it. Give it a try, Lanigan pleaded. All right, here goes. Samson's forehead wrinkled and shed as he concentrated. Then he said, It seems to me that we inspect the world through our senses, and therefore we must in the final analysis accept the testimony of our senses. Lanigan nodded. So, Tom, we know that a thing exists because our senses tell us so. How do we check the accuracy of our observations? By comparing them with the sensory impressions of other men. We know that our senses don't lie when other men's senses agree upon the existence of the thing in question. Lanigan thought about this and said, Therefore the real world is simply what most men think it is? Samson's mouth twisted. I told you that metaphysics was not my forte. Still, I think it is an accurate and acceptable demonstration. Yes, but, Doc, suppose all of those observers are wrong. For instance, suppose there are many worlds and many realities, not just one. Suppose this is simply one arbitrary existence out of an infinitude. Or suppose that the nature of reality itself is capable of change, and that somehow I am able to perceive those changes. Samson sighed. He found a little green bat fluttering inside his jacket and absent-mindedly crushed it with a ruler. There you are, he said. I can't disprove a single one of your suppositions, Tom. I think we had better run through the entire dream once again. Lanigan grimaced. I'd rather not. I have a feeling. I know you do, Samson said, smiling faintly, but this will prove or disprove it once and for all, won't it? I guess so, Lanigan said. He took courage, unwisely, and said, Well, the way it begins, the way my dream starts? And even as he spoke, the horror came over him. He felt dizzy, sick, terrified. He tried to rise from the couch. The doctor's face ballooned over him. He saw a glint of metal, heard Samson saying, Try to relax. You're having a brief seizure. Try to think of something pleasant. Then either Lanigan or the world, or perhaps both, passed out. Lanigan and or the world came back to consciousness. Time may or may not have passed. Anything might or might not have happened. Lanigan sat up and looked at Dr. Samson. How do you feel now, Tom? I'm all right, Lanigan said. What happened? Well, you had a bad moment. Take it easy for a bit. Lanigan leaned back and tried to calm himself. The doctor was sitting at his desk, writing notes. Lanigan counted to 20 with his eyes closed, then opened them cautiously. Samson was still at his desk, writing notes. Lanigan looked around the room, counted the 5 pictures on the wall, and recounted them. He looked at the green carpet, frowned at it, closed his eyes again, and this time he counted to 50. Well, care to talk about it now? Samson asked, shutting his notebook. No, not just now, Lanigan said. 5 paintings, green carpet. Just as you please, the doctor said. I think that our time is just about up, but if you'd care to lie down in the anteroom... No, thanks. I'll go home, Lanigan said. He stood up, walked across the green carpet to the door, looked back at the 5 paintings and the doctor, who smiled at him encouragingly. Then Lanigan went through the door and into the anteroom, through the anteroom to the outer door, through that and down the corridor to the stairs, and down the stairs to the street. He walked and looked at the trees, on which green leaves moved faintly and predictably in a faint breeze. There was traffic, which moved soberly down one side of the street and up the other. The sky was an unchanging blue, and obviously had been for quite some time. Dream? He pinched himself. A dream pinch? He did not awaken. He shouted. An imaginary shout? He did not waken. He was in the street of the world of his nightmare. The street at first seemed like any normal city street. There were paving stones, cars, people, buildings, a sky overhead, a sun in that sky, all perfectly normal except that nothing was happening. The pavement never once yielded beneath his feet. Over there was the First National City Bank. It had been here yesterday, which was bad enough, but worse, it would be there without fail tomorrow, and the day after that, and the year after that. The First National City Bank, founded 1892, was grotesquely devoid of possibilities. It would never become a tomb, an airplane, or the bones of a prehistoric monster. Sullenly, it would remain a building of concrete and steel, madly persisting in its fixity until men with tools came and tediously tore it down. Lanigan walked through this petrified world, under a blue sky that oozed a sly white around the edges, teasingly promising something that was never delivered. Traffic moved implacably to the right. People crossed at crossings. Clocks were within minutes of agreement. Somewhere between the towns lay countryside, but Lanigan knew that the grass did not grow under one's feet. It simply lay still, growing no doubt, but imperceptibly, unsensed by your senses. And the mountains were still tall and black, but they were giants stopped in mid-stride. They would never march against a golden or purple or green sky. The essence of life, Dr. Sampson had once said, is change. The essence of death is immobility. Even a corpse has a vestige of life about it as long as its flesh rots, as long as maggots still feast on its blind eyes and blowflies suck the juice from the burst intestines. Lanigan looked around at the corpse of the world. He perceived that it was dead, and he screamed. He screamed while people gathered around and stared at him, but didn't do anything or become anything. And then a policeman came, as he was supposed to, but the sun didn't change shape once. And then an ambulance came down the invariant street, but without trumpets, minus trumpets, and on 4 wheels instead of a pleasing 3 or 25. And the ambulance men brought him to a building, which is exactly where they expected to find it. And there was a great deal of talk by people who stood untransformed, asking questions in a room with white walls. And there was evening, and there was morning, and it was the first day. The author's name is Robert Sheckley, and the title of the story is The Petrified World. Tom Lanigan expected the world to change erratically, variably, and more or less constantly. And when he came out of his little coma in Dr. Sampson's office and found that the world no longer changed in that fashion, he had lost the future he was familiar with, the future he expected, a future in which anything could happen and probably would at any given moment. And the world around him was not a world he knew, not a world to which he could adjust. May God bless and keep you all.